So today we're going to be making one of my favorite recipes, cinnamon rolls. Alright, so to get started we're going to go through the ingredients. Okay, so what we're going to need for this recipe is 2¼ teaspoons of dry yeast, 1 cup of warm milk, 1/2 cup of sugar, 1/3 cup of margarine, a teaspoon of salt, 2 eggs, and 4 cups of flour. So now we're going to start making the cinnamon rolls. And what I like to do first is I like to get the milk going because it's good to activate the yeast before we get started. To do that, we need to warm up the milk. Now, because yeast is actually a living thing, what we want to do is we want to make the milk nice and warm. Now, it should be about the same temperature you'd like for a warm bath. Not too hot, not too cold. So we're going to put this in the microwave for about 25 seconds and then see how it's going. Alright, well that's going, I'm going to measure out my sugar because I'm going to put half the sugar into the milk so we can feed the yeast and get it going. So I have my sugar here and the recipe calls for 1/2 cup of sugar. So I'm going to take a spoon for leveling here and my 1/2 cup measuring spoon, and I'm going to measure out my 1/2 cup of sugar, just like so, and then I'm going to go and get my milk out of the microwave, which should be ready by now. My milk, I'm going to pour on about half the sugar. Now it doesn't have to be exact. The rest of it's going to go in with the rest of the mix. And I'm going to give that a quick stir. And then I'm going to measure out my yeast. So I have just regular old Fleischmann's yeast. This one's actually for bread machines, but I'm cheating. I'm going to use it in this recipe anyway, and I'm going to level off my teaspoons. So there's 1, 2, and finally 1/4 teaspoons. Now if you have the packets instead of the jar of yeast, it's just 1 packet of yeast for this recipe. Okay, so now that that's going, I'm going to give that a quick stir. I'm going to put that aside for later. Alright. Okay. So now we can get going on the rest of the recipe. And I'm going to start by cracking and beating my eggs. So in a separate bowl, I'm going to crack 2 eggs, one at a time. There's 1. There's 2. Now, I'm going to beat those eggs up and get them ready for our recipe. Alright. And I'm just going to put those off to the side now. Alright. Give my hands a quick rinse. And next I'm going to start with the dry ingredients. So the dry ingredients was the flour and the salt. So we're not too far off being done here. We just need to measure out the flour and the salt and then mix it up, and we're going to be making a dough. Now this is not a whole lot different than just a regular bread dough. So if you've made that before, this is pretty similar. The biggest thing is after it's been kneaded, we need to let it rise for at least an hour. I like to give it 2. So that's 3 and 4 cups of flour. Okay, so now that that's done, we can do our salt. 1 teaspoon of salt. And I'm just going to do this over the sink in case I pour too much. And then put the salt in there. Okay. So now we've got the dry ingredients ready to go. We've got our yeast starting to go here. Give that another quick stir. I've got our eggs, and the last thing we need is our margarine. So the recipe calls for 1/3 cup of margarine. So I'm going to just use a regular knife, and I'm going to try to fill up that 1/3 measuring cup. Now you've got to be careful because you can just cover up the top and you won't actually have 1/3 of a cup. So you want to try to work the margin in there a bit to make sure that you don't have any air spots. So after you have gotten that, you can put that into the mix. Alright, so here we are. We're going to put the mix onto the stand mixer and mix this up till we get a nice lump of dough. I'm going to use the dough hook on this, and I'm going to start this up and let it go until that has mixed all the way in. And we actually want it to be kind of collecting on the dough hook until we have a nice, well-kneaded dough. So this is what we're looking for in our dough. We want it to be very smooth and well worked, and it's actually sticking to the side a little bit, but we have a nice big blob of dough on our dough hook. So at this point, our dough is done being mixed. We can turn off the mixer. And there we go. We can pop this off and put that aside to rise for 1 to 2 hours or longer if you need to. Alright, so we have our dough. What we're going to do is we are going to take a glass bowl and we're just going to spray that down with a little non-stick spray because we don't want the dough sticking to the bowl after it's risen. Then what I like to do is just grab a silicone spatula and I'm going to just kind of pop the dough out of our mixing bowl and into our glass bowl to let it rise. So we'll just work that out until we can get that out of our mixing bowl. Like so. Alright. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover that up with some saran wrap, because if you just leave it, what tends to happen is your dough dries out. And there we go, saran wrap. So I'm just going to leave that aside. Now, you might be thinking, put this in the fridge so it stays good. It's actually fine outside of the fridge. If you put it in the fridge, it's going to be harder for the yeast to get your dough to rise. It's going to take a lot longer. Now, that's not a bad thing if you want to do up the dough the night before, put it in the fridge, and then have it ready to go in the morning. But since we're going to be making this today, I'm going to leave that outside in the open kitchen so that it has time to rise in the warmth. That way it will be done a lot faster, and in 1 to 2 hours this will be ready to roll out and make cinnamon rolls out. Now it's been a couple hours and our dough has risen. It's actually quite large now and it's ready to go. But before we make the dough or roll out the dough, what we're going to do is we're going to make the filling. So in order to make the filling, what we're going to need is we're going to need 1/3 cup of butter. Now you can use margarine, but I found that the filling actually will run out of the cinnamon rolls a little bit more easily if you use margarine. So butter is kind of the good option there because it's not going to fall out quite as much. You also need 1 cup of packed brown sugar and 3 tablespoons of cinnamon. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in the brown sugar into my measuring cup here. And then I'm going to pack it down.
Says my dog.
Because if you leave it loose, you're actually going to not have enough brown sugar in there. So you want to get it to about a cup and then just push it down and see how close you are to the 1 cup mark. So that's actually pretty good right there. So there's my cup of brown sugar. To that I'm going to add my 3 tablespoons of cinnamon. So we have 1, 2, 3. Okay. And now we'll just give that a good stir. And if you have any clumps in the brown sugar, just try to break them up with the spoon. And stir that until you have a nice consistent mix in there. Alright. So now that our brown sugar is well mixed, we're going to put that and the butter off to the side until later, and we're going to roll out our dough. Now, in order to do this, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to flour your surface. The flour is going to keep it from sticking to the surface, but you don't want to overdo it because if you put too much flour down, it can really dry out your dough. So do a generous layer underneath and try to keep it nice and even, because you don't want to have to scrape off your dough because it's sticking and reapply flour, because then you're going to have too much flour. So put enough down so you only have to do it once. I like to sprinkle some flour on top of my dough so that when I try to pull that out, it won't stick to my hands. I'll just give that a quick pat. And then I'm going to try to get the dough out of the bowl. I'll flour the other side. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up the dough and I'm actually going to let gravity stretch it out a little bit. And the reason I do that is because, well, I need it kind of long for my cutting board here when I roll it out. And if I just leave it as a blob, it's going to be too wide. We kind of want a long dough so that it's easier to roll it and cut it into strips. So now that I have my long strip here, I'm going to just use my rolling pin to try to get that so I can have a nice long, relatively rectangular strip of dough that I can then cut up into cinnamon rolls. Now, if you're wondering how thin to make this, basically you want it pretty much as thin as you can get it, because the thinner you get, the better the ratio of filling to the dough. Otherwise, if you have a thick dough, you're going to have a very bready cinnamon bun. And you want to really taste the filling. So you get that nice and thin. So, just like I was buttering a big piece of bread, you really want to make sure that your butter is well softened. So I'm just going to stick this back in the microwave for a few more seconds. So I'm just going to continue to spread that until I've covered all of my dough. Alright, so now that this is pretty much done, what we're going to do is we're going to get out the filling that we made earlier. We're just going to sprinkle it on top of our dough. So I just give it a good sprinkle, and we can spread it around a little bit afterwards. It's going to be a little bit messy, but that's okay. The butter helps to let it stick, so you can kind of mush it around with a spoon afterwards and just try to hit any of the areas that you might have missed so that you have a nice consistent fill of the filling across all of your dough. So when you're done, it should look something like this. At this point, we are ready to roll this up and make our cinnamon rolls. Okay. So now that we have our cinnamon rolls done, all we're going to do is we're going to take this and we're going to roll the whole thing up so that we have a big tube of cinnamon rolls. Try to get your rolls nice and tight if you can. Alright, so there we have our cinnamon roll. And what I'm going to do is cut off the end. There. And what I'm going to do with the end pieces, I'm actually going to spray down a couple of casserole dishes. It's actually a loaf pan, but it works just fine. And I'm going to put the ends, which tend to be a little bit thinner, into the loaf pan. You don't usually get very nice rolls on the end. But once you get 2 or 3 rolls in, they start getting a little bit bigger. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to cut the rolls so they're about an inch or so thick. I'm going to do a bunch of cuts, and then I can put those into our baking dish. And if they start to unravel when you pick them up, you can just kind of pinch around the end there to make it stay. Alright, so now I have all the cinnamon rolls cut up, and you can see they're about an inch or so across, and we're just going to place those into our baking tray so that we have about 9 in the square pan. And they're going to end up kind of coming together. So that one's coming apart a little bit. So I'm just going to give it a little bit of a pinch there and place them all in. So we're going to have our cinnamon rolls spaced out in our baking dish, ready to go into the oven. So we're going to bake them in the oven for about 20 or so minutes at 400 degrees Fahrenheit. And when they come out, they should be nicely golden on the top. So the oven is now ready at 400 degrees Fahrenheit, and I'm going to put the cinnamon rolls in. You can see that one of these batches actually makes a lot of cinnamon rolls. So what I did was I actually took one of the dishes and I covered it up with saran wrap. I'm going to put that in the fridge for tomorrow because I always think that these cinnamon rolls are best when they're fresh out of the oven. I'm going to bake up the rest of these, and then whatever leftovers I have can be kept in the refrigerator or frozen, and we'll just pull it out whenever you need them. Alright, so I'm going to put the dishes that are ready to go in the oven and leave those for about 20 minutes. So it's been 20 minutes now. Let's take a look at the cinnamon rolls and see how they look. Alright, there we go. You can see they really filled up the pan, so they're looking pretty good there. And there we go. Our little ones. And that's what they should look like when they're done. Alright. Well, if you like that, you can try making some white icing or something to go with that. Let them cool for a good 10 minutes or so, and then they're ready to serve with a little bit of icing. Hope you enjoy.